Every vine that bears fruit, He prunes that it may bear more fruit. In John chapter 15, Jesus uses the metaphor of a grapevine describing the relationship between Him and His disciples. He makes the point in chapter 15 and verse 1 that He is the true vine and that we're to be the branches. And the objective of that is to bear fruit. But He goes on to tell us that we have help in that process of bearing fruit. He says in verse 1 that my Father is the vine dresser. In other words, God's superintending our progress in Christ. He's watching it. He goes on to say in that verse that every branch in me that does not bear fruit, He takes away. In other words, we're joined to Christ with an objective in mind, and that is to bear fruit. And if we're not bearing fruit, we're not going to be pleasing to God. And the branches will be cut off and taken away that do not bear fruit. In verse 6 he says, anyone that does not abide in me, He cast out as a branch and is withered. And they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. But it also tells us that this vine dresser knows how to help us in our progress in growing and bearing fruit. You notice in verse 2 it says, every branch that bears fruit He prunes that it may bear more fruit. Pruning of a grapevine usually takes place in the winter or the early spring, in which the branches that have grown long are cut back close to the vine. It looks pretty damaging to the vine actually when it takes place. You wonder if it's going to recover. But that cutting back process, the branches close to the vine, actually increases the growth of the vine and certainly increases the productivity and fruitfulness of the vine. And if we're going to bear much fruit in Christ, sometimes we too have to be pruned back close to the vine. Sometimes the vine dresser does this in a number of ways. He may do this through discipline or chastening. The Hebrew writer makes the point in chapter 12 and verse 5, you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as sons. My sons, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by Him. For whom the Lord loves, He chastens and scourges every son whom He receives. The Hebrew writer reminds us that's not always pleasant. Verse 11 says, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, after it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Some of God's most productive servants had a number of times in their life where they were pruned back close to the vine. It seemed that they suffered great, devastating losses. But these losses actually caused them to be more productive in the work that the Lord had for them to do. It may be that way in our life as well. There's a true vine, and if we're a Christian, we must be connected to that vine. And there's a vine dresser who superintends and watches over that we may grow and be as fruitful as possible.